Hi folks, in this video we're going to talk about Ivan's speech rebellion. What I want you to do is pause your videos here and see if you can notice how thematically this relates to other events in the novel, in the story. So pause your videos and see if you can think of all the different ways in which this might relate to some of the other subplots. Okay, that was your last chance to pause your videos. The thing I want you to realize is, even though this is an abstract philosophical discussion between two characters who happen to sit down at a cafe for this interlude in the middle of the novel, Dostoevsky has carefully constructed this speech. And all of these discussions, there's so many subplots in this hugely sprawling novel, they all contribute to the same themes though, and they all interrelate in really deep ways. So of course this speech relates to the Karamazov condition, the fact that the five Karamazovs represent different forms of despair, and we want to understand what authentic living is, whether there's a God or not, and what the meaning of suffering is. Those grand existential questions naturally relate to the philosophical structure of the novel and the characters. But even the other subplots too. Remember the character of Snegurov and his little boy Ilyusha, who is ill. Snegurov is the guy who works for Grushenka, and she tells him to go up and buy the notes of debt that Dmitri owes to his father, so that they can get Dmitri in trouble and get him thrown in debtor's prison. Well, Dmitri then confronts Snegurov, beats him up a little bit, challenges him to a duel, insults his honor. And it's hard for us maybe to sympathize with this in 1800s Russia, but this was deeply insulting. This was crisis engendering, this kind of act. And of course, the little boy then gets tormented for it. So he's already spiritually tormented. He's tormented in the novel by being sick. And of course, that seems unjust. That is exactly the kind of things Ivan is talking about in his speech. But he is then, the other boys all throw snowballs at him, and he's mistreated by the other children and the other people because of the acts of his father. And this is exactly what Ivan is talking about. So when Ivan makes reference to all this various forms of childhood suffering, that we're supposed to realize that this connects intricately with the subplots of the story. And we can really only understand what Dostoevsky wants to say about Ivan's speech, whether Dostoevsky is going to endorse Ivan's perspective or reject it, by thinking about how the plot actually works out with these other characters. What happens to Ilyusha and Snegurov by the end of the story? Okay, let's talk more about the details that Ivan goes over. It's really, so much of it just is taken up with the different forms of suffering that innocent children have to put up with. And what's really important is Ivan says, I'm going to just put aside grown-ups for now. They're disgusting and don't deserve love. They ate from the apple. They at least have the understanding of good versus evil. And who hasn't, by the time they're a grown-up, done something sinful that they deserve punishment for? But children are different. How could they possibly deserve all of the horrific things that happen to them? That's really what Ivan wants to know. Notice, well, let me point out, in regards to Ivan's existential condition, these lines where he's saying, like, grown-ups are disgusting and don't deserve love, this really encapsulates, in my opinion, how Ivan is not in touch with spiritual love. I never understood how it's possible to love one's neighbor. This really shows that Ivan doesn't understand fully the spiritual side of love, and he only has a very detached conception. He understands love in a way, but it's different, very different from Alyosha's way of understanding it. Let me also say something about the last bit now of this quote that I had on the screen previously. It's because how could we possibly justify what's happening to children? You could say, well, since their father sinned, they deserve sin to be punished because the fathers ate from the apple. And so all of humanity is in some ways tainted by this original sin. Well, Ivan says, and this I think is quite insightful, hey, that is reasoning for another world. If we think that, then there is no way that we're making sense of this suffering here on earth. That's the kind of otherworldly reasoning, like, oh, it's all going to be made good in heaven. But that doesn't justify why they're suffering now. That just says God will tip the scales later and make things right. But if that's our explanation, it has nothing to do with giving an earthly explanation why here and now such horrible things could be happening. Now, there's a deep philosophical tradition that discusses these issues, and it's known as the problem of evil. So I thought I should give you this straightforwardly. We can actually treat this as an important philosophical work and see how it tries to give us some commentary on these ideas. here's one way of thinking about how the problem works. Premise number one is just an observation. This is an empirical fact. There's a lot of evil in the world. Sometimes people worry about the word evil and they think, well, that's already religiously colored the way in which that depicts the situation. Just substitute the word suffering in here if you'd like something that's not clearly doesn't have such strong religious tones to it. There's certainly a lot of suffering in the world, granted. And also, according to Christianity, there's a certain type of God. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. So omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. That is part of the Christian God. But how would such a God allow evil? That doesn't really make sense. And so the problem says, if those two premises are true, then there can be no such God. Because if there was such a God, it wouldn't allow all of that evil. Given that there's evil, there can't be such a God. Now, let's think about how you could, all right, before we go to replies, let me ask you this. I just want you to pause your videos and think for a minute. Do you think this provides some kind of evidence against Christianity or any kind of theism that posits a God with all of those properties? So pause your videos now and try to make up your mind before we talk about different types of reply. Okay, that was your chance to think through these ideas on your own. There's a lot of important replies one can make to this argument. And ultimately, so the argument as it stands now, this is just the beginning of the philosophical discussion. In philosophy, you have to not just put forward some views, you have to then consider all the good objections against them and see if the objections are actually successful. So what kind of replies have folks given to the problem of evil? Well, there's several different groups of them. I'll just cover three. So the classic one, the one that's most famous, is called the free will defense. Basically what it says is, in order to create a maximally good world, a world that actually had moral qualities to it, agents who could act morally, God had to allow the possibility that humans would do bad things. Because if we didn't have that kind of free will and the possibility to live in a world with large amounts of evil, and often much of that evil is because humans are using their free will nefariously, then God wouldn't have made a creation that has all of these morally good qualities, like creatures who do know the difference between good and evil. So the existence of free will in some ways explains why God made the world that he did. And really, the amounts of evil that we see in the world are due to humans misusing their will rather than God causing the evil or something like that. Now, so that's one type of reply. Now, there's important replies to, or replies to the reply or objections to that. But let me just tell you a couple other ideas folks have put forward. I mean, one is it's called skeptical theism or the skeptical defense. Basically, this is you throw your hands up and say, yeah, you're right. We don't understand how this could be possible, but God is mysterious. God is infinite, and we're just finite little humans. How could we possibly do it? So there must be some explanation, but we don't know what it is. And skepticism refers to our lack of knowledge. Like skepticism about the external world in philosophy means we don't know that there is an external world. So this is skepticism about God's fundamental motivations or designs. So the idea is, yeah, God must have some sort of reason. We just don't know what it is. A third type of response, of course, you could go Kierkegaard route. Kierkegaard, remember, thinks that Christianity is paradoxical and incoherent and puzzling and absurd. So Kierkegaard could just throw his hands up and say, yeah, you're right, this does show evidence against God, but you should believe nonetheless on the strength of the absurd. Your religious beliefs don't ultimately need to make sense, according to Kierkegaard. Actually, true faith only comes when they don't make sense. So this argument, Kierkegaard could just admit the cogency of this argument and say that goes along perfectly fine with his view about religious faith. Okay, now let's go back to this passage from the text. So here's something that Ivan says, can you understand this nonsense? My friend, my brother, my godly and humble novice, can you understand why this nonsense is needed and created? Without it, they say, man could not even have lived on earth, for he would not have known good and evil. So if this, hopefully you can understand what this response is. I want you to pause your videos and think, if somebody's making this response, so Ivan is not giving his own view here. He's speaking hypothetically about a kind of reply you could make to the argument. He's going through the philosophical objections and replies here. So pause your videos and think, with this objection, which premise would folks reject in the argument? Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. So I hope you recognize Ivan is actually considering the free will defense here. This is what he's hypothetically considering, and he actually doesn't find it convincing. Now, if you do engage in the free will defense, what you would reject is premise number two. So that's the answer. Because according to the free will defense, it's not true that an omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent God would not allow this amount of evil. He would allow this amount of evil precisely because he wants to create humans who have knowledge of good and evil, or who have free will and can do various acts and have moral qualities to them. They're not just sort of puppets or something else. So what's really interesting is Ivan is doing fascinating philosophy. This speech actually is engaging in some of these really deep philosophical debates about the nature of theism. And it's also interesting that Ivan ultimately says that's not even worth it. If you are truly sympathetic to suffering, if you really understand benevolence, then you would not make that pact. Or God should have done better. God could have created a world. God could have foreseen, even with humans, beings with free wills. If God has all knowledge, he could have foreseen the ones in which humans grossly misuse their free will versus the worlds in which humans are a little better behaved, and he would have gone with one of those other worlds. So this is Ivan's famous talk about returning the ticket. I don't think it's worth such a price. In some ways, what's fascinating here is the atheist Ivan is taking the moral high ground, and he is saying, if you're a theist and you really care about the suffering of others, this is such a central theme of Christianity, then you wouldn't even accept this bargain because it's not worth such a price. So he says, it's not that I don't accept God. You know, I can make perfect sense of God. I'm just going to return him the ticket. Yeah, a really amazing metaphor for this philosophical position that Ivan occupies. And I think it's, you know, ultimately Dostoevsky is not going to side with Ivan by the end of the novel. You have to think about, I mean, it's fascinating that Dostoevsky puts views he disagrees with so well eloquently put in characters who he fundamentally thinks are problematic. So what we need to do is follow Ivan's fate, and understanding the character of Ivan is really essential to understanding Dostoevsky's whole story. Okay, let me give you one more bit from this really philosophically interesting bit from the reading. So pause your videos now. Consider this objection. So Ivan says, what about some joker who says, in any case, the child will grow up and have time enough to sin? So that's why all this suffering can exist and now. Okay, so pause your videos here and see if you can answer this. What premise would this objector refer to, or would reject in the argument? Okay, that's your chance to pause your videos. So this is another defense of rejection of premise number two. So this doesn't deny that there is evil in the world. In fact, I think it's really hard to reject premise number one once we rephrase it as just suffering. How could you deny that there's lots of bad suffering that goes on in the world? Even a lot of suffering which it's hard to see any redeeming purpose for. You know, suffering that somebody exists and, you know, has to go through early in life, but it makes them a better, stronger person by the end of their life. That kind of suffering we can make perfect sense of. But it seems pretty undeniable that there's a whole lot of suffering that has no redeeming value to it, where it ends young people's lives and doesn't allow them to even grow out and get something beneficial for it. Of course, this is another religious defense. Like, so it's a part of some versions of Christianity that every human is born with original sin, or part of being human is to be tainted by you know, Adam's tasting of the apple and fall from the Garden of Eden. And so it doesn't matter if the children are innocent now. They're human. They're not going to stay innocent for the rest of their lives. So again, this would be another kind of explanation. This wouldn't necessarily rely on the free will redeeming the existence of the suffering. It would, in a sense, be a way of justifying why the people do deserve the suffering that they get. That would be another sort of Christian or theistic version view to reject premise number two. Of course, Ivan doesn't buy it. So this quote continues. You know, what about if you think about all of the horrific things that can happen to children? You just need to read the news better on Ivan's way of thinking. And you need a stronger moral compass if you think that this is actually redeemable, justifiable whatsoever. So Yvonne gives us a really interesting discussion and argument against theism about this topic of free will. Now, of course, what does Alyosha think about this? This is something we're going to talk about in future videos. Thanks.